Returning to visualization, analysis, and design, let's talk about how to arrange different data sets. We're going to start out with tables. How do we arrange tabular data? So we did talk about three different data types, tables and networks and spatial data. In this section, we are going to focus on tables. We're going to actually bring up a lot of ideas that will also apply to the other two, but we're going to start with this because in some sense it is the simplest data type to explain some of these basic ideas through. So let's come back to the idea of keys and values because it's important for this discussion. So recall that I'm using the word item to mean rows in a simple table and attributes to mean the columns. A cell contains a value. And we think of the keys as the independent attribute. That is what we use to look stuff up in the table. And in a simple table, you've got just one key. In a multidimensional table, you'll have multiple keys. And in contrast to this independent attribute, the dependent attribute, the value of a cell, is something that we can then get out of that data set. Now, the key thing for thinking about visual encoding idioms is that we're going to classify idioms for visualizing tabular data, by the number of keys that are used as the backbone of the spatial layout, the spatial arrangement of that data. Whether it's got no keys at all, so we just have values, we're expressing a value with the visualization, or whether we are basing it on one key, in which case we've got some sort of a list, whether it's horizontal or vertical, or two keys, in which case we have this aligned two-dimensional matrix style layout. So let's start with a scatter plot because that's a case where we don't have keys, we just have values. So think of it, there's a quantitative attribute and you just want to directly express that attribute in the visual encoding. So in some ways, that's one of the most straightforward things we can do. So what we see here is we're going to analyze this systematically. We're going to think, okay, what's the data? Two quantitative attributes. What's the mark type? It's a point mark. What's going on at the channels? We are separately encoding vertical and horizontal and vertical spatial position on the display are these channels we're using to convey that data. Now, what are they good for? Well, the tasks that are common with scatterplots are finding trends, noticing outliers. The exact definition of an outlier, of course, depends. That's part of why we want to use visualization to inspect this data, understand distribution separately of that horizontal and that vertical axis, look at correlation between the two attributes, and find cluster structure. And these are all tasks people have often done with scatterplots. Now, what I'm going to do in addition to talking about tasks is also systematically talk about scalability, assuming a display of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, just to give us something easy to think about for the purposes of comparison. Let's think about what is the scale at which this idiom works. So in this case, we'll think, how many items can I have? How many point marks until suddenly the clutter gets so strong it's going to be hard to see? Clearly, we can accommodate hundreds of items if we had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. You know, if we had 10,000 items, maybe we'd get a huge amount of overplotting and it would be hard to know what to do. We'll talk about some solutions for this later on, but in this basic, let's just discuss the fundamental layouts. We're going to think about the limits of scalability given no other additional approaches. Now, we can use this base idea to still encode more channels. For example, we could, as we've already talked about, we could encode more because we've got the point marks, because these are unconstrained, so we could shape code and size code. We could color code the point marks, we could size code them, we could shape code them. They don't have to be round, right? These points could be any shape we want. What I do want you to notice when size coding in scatterplots is if you're using a circle shape for your mark, if you've got a single quantitative attribute that you're trying to size code, be aware that, of course, the area of a circle grows quadratically. So if you're controlling the two-dimensional area with a single quantitative attribute, you don't want to just map that attribute to the radius because that would be misleading. You'd want to take the square root if what you've got in terms of your graphics toolkit is to actually draw circles with the radius. Think about these issues about what you are actually trying to encode. So there's what you're encoding and what they're decoding. Make sure that if you're encoding using two-dimensional area of this sort of a point mark, If you want them to decode the right thing, you have to do a transformation of your data before you encode it with this approach. Let's go back to those tasks just to get a more deep understanding of those. So with correlation, positive correlation is a tight line in one direction, negative correlation is a tight line along the diagonal on the other. And then as you get less and less correlation, you see more and more of a spread of those values. This is something that is, known to some audiences and not to others. It's certainly more and more taught these days in terms of basic sort of visualization literacy, although it's not universal. Now, what else could you do with a scatter plot? You could look for cluster structure. You might have a conjectured cluster structure and you want to know if in fact that's what's there when you actually plot it. Maybe you have a known class structure that you could color code and you want to see whether you see a spatial clustering of the data that matches up or doesn't match with this color-coded class status. So these are some of the things people can use scatter plots for. Well, what if instead of just having quantitative attributes, what if we do have some keys? How do we want to think about that? So another idea is regions. What we want to do is use regions to separate and order and align. So let's talk through that. What do I mean by region, first of all? By region, I just mean some contiguous bounded area that's distinct from any other spatial region. And a key idea is that what we're doing is we are separating one mark per region. We're basically saying, we have to somehow plot this data. We're going to make sure that each region contains only one mark, in contrast to the scatter plot, where we could actually have overplotting depending on those values. So with these kinds of idioms, we're separating things out so that we get one mark per region. We'll talk about more complex things a bit later. And then we are separating into regions according to any attribute. It could be categorical, it could be ordered, ordinal or quantitative. So there's no conflict with the expressiveness principle because separating into regions of space is something that we can do with any kind of attribute. But here's the key thing. If what we want to do with these spatial regions is have any sort of an ordering of them, and if we have them ordered, we could also choose to align them. Well, now we should use an ordered attribute because as the word order suggests, if we want to order things, we have to be careful about what's in that data. So let's look at an example. Surely you've all seen bar charts. So if you've got a bar chart ordered according to the same attribute you're using to encode the lengths of the bars, you can really read off information very easily. We can see not only, high values and low values, but we can make really subtle distinctions between things like those mid-ranked things like, Chelsea versus Liverpool. So a thing to notice is we can make fine-grained comparisons because the baseline of all of these bars is the same. We're not just making a length comparison, we're making an aligned spatial position comparison. So very high precision here. Now, in contrast to what? Well, you could have a bar chart where you're not ordering according to the data, where you're ordering according to something else. In this case, it's just alphabetical. So we can still get some pop out of that really huge bar, Manchester United, and tiny bars, Norwich City. But it's much harder to try to figure out, well, what's fourth, what's seventh? Looking at a single bar unordered, although you have to do quite a lot of keeping track of things and in a way that you just didn't have to do if they were ordered for you. And something that's even harder to do is even to figure out the sizes. If now we've got these size coded circles, even if we get the square root area thing under control, it's quite hard to understand these sort of middle ground. Sure, we can still see the biggest and the smallest, but it's much harder to make fine-grained comparisons of size with these circle areas than it was with those aligned lengths. So let's think about this idiom of a bar chart and do our systematic analysis on it. Well, what have we got? We've got one key and one value. So the data set we're showing here is we've got some attribute. In this case, it's categorical, although it could also be something ordered like time. And so we've got our categorical attribute. we've split, and for each one, and in this case, we're looking at animal type as that. So, there's one mark for each one of these spatial regions. And then we've got our quantitative attribute where we've got the average weight of that animal, and it's just being expressed by this aligned vertical spatial position channel. So a thing to notice, as we have just talked about, is you could order it just by something a bit arbitrary, like the alphabetical order of the label, or you could order it by something more data-driven, like the same attribute you're using to encode the length. What are bar charts good for? Well, we can compare individual items, right? We've already talked about high precision comparison being very straightforward because we have aligned spatial position as our channel. We can certainly use it to just look up a value. If you know the name of your animal, like wombat, you can just look that up. If what you're using to understand that is the same thing, of course, that you've used to order the data with. Now, in terms of scalability, well, in terms of that key attribute, the one that in this case is along the horizontal axis, if we had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, we could certainly fit dozens. Maybe we could even fit hundreds of levels for that key attribute. In terms of the quantitative attribute, we can make very, very fine-grained spatial comparisons between those bar heights, so many hundreds of levels. In the limit, maybe it's pushing it a little bit to get all the way to 1,000 levels, because that would be 1 pixel differences, but we can definitely start to get to a few. So it's hundreds of levels for both key and quantitative attributes for the bar chart, for both the key and the value. Okay, now again, we can have this idea that we're using this as a base and then we're adding more complexity. So we could say, well, what if we add a second key, but still keep the fundamental backbone of the idea of a bar chart? We could have a stacked bar chart where we use that second categorical attribute to actually divide up, again, spatial regions. We now have a vertical stack of line marks. So for each one of these, we don't just have a single mark. We actually have this composite object where we have multiple marks that are aligned. I'm going to call this a glyph, and we'll talk more about glyphs later on. So what channels are we using? Well, clearly we're still using that length channel. We're using color. And with these spatial regions, well, there's something a bit interesting here, right? We have aligned comparison of only certain things. We have it for the entire glyph, just like the whole bar, and we have it for that low component, in this case, the red component at the bottom. We have aligned spatial comparison in those cases. But now we have unaligned length comparisons for the green bars and the green segments and the blue segments. So notice how only some of these are aligned, some are unaligned. And so we have high precision for the aligned, lower precision for the unaligned lengths. Now, what task are we doing here? We're doing part-to-whole relationships. We're trying to understand, in addition to the basic tasks of bar charts, we've added the ability to do that part-to-whole comparison with those segments. Now, when we think about the scalability in this case, there's an asymmetry. These two attributes that we're using for keys, they're not created equal. For the main key attribute, the bars, it's just like before. But for that stacked key, the one we're using to stack the number of segments we have, this would not work at all. If we had hundreds of segments, we would have no hope of deciphering this. So it's a much smaller number of attribute levels that's legitimate for that stacked attribute. Maybe 10 to a dozen levels could be reasonable, but a stacked bar chart with 40 different segments won't be comprehensible. So notably, an asymmetry, we're often interested in these scalability analyses of these places where there are asymmetries. Here's an interesting one. A stream graph is a generalization of a stacked bar chart. And it's really emphasizing horizontal continuity rather than just this idea of reading things off for an individual time point. So here's one. These have been used a bit by the New York Times. And in data journalism. So we've got a categorical key attribute, which is movies, and an ordered key attribute, which is time, and then this quantitative value attribute, which is counts, like how many times were the movies watched. This is box office data that they were originally looking at here. And what's interesting about what they've done is they have derived geometry where they're making these layers, they're really emphasizing horizontal continuity across these horizontal layers that are as if they had a bunch of stacked bars where they made sure to have the same order of the stacks. And so you're able to get this sort of perceptual sense of when the layers are large and when they are smaller. So the derived data is this geometry of the layers where the height of the layer encodes counts. Now, you're not really able to get high precision data out of this. If what you wanted to do was look up exact revenue for a particular movie at a particular day, this wouldn't be a good choice. But if you're trying to get some overall sense of that, what happened at the box office, there's some interesting aspects about this. They explicitly compute a derived attribute, which is what is the order to put these layers in, where that's a global computation across the entire data set. You don't want that to be different for the different time points. Now, what's interesting about this is how is this differently scalable than a simple stacked bar chart? Now, what's true is that they are making some assumptions about their data set that, particularly for this movie data, that you start out and you get a bunch of your revenue and then you sort of very quickly fall off. And so what they're able to do is they are able to fit not just a fairly small number of movies, like you might assume with the stacked bar chart where I said, oh, even 20 categories in your segments would be a lot. They're actually dealing with hundreds of movies. And the reason they can get away with this is that most of the layers don't actually extend across the whole chart. So they're emphasizing certain things, and then you're losing the ability to do other things. So these are not for precision, but they are able to show you some structure that would be essentially impossible with the stacked bar chart. Now, also notice how they're not labeling every single movie here. They've only actually labeled some of the larger ones. This was an interactive application, so you could go in with a mouse and actually get much more than you can see just in the single static visual encoding. Okay, let's think about another common chart type and do that systematic analysis with this. What about a line chart? And let me start actually by analyzing just a dot chart. So what are we doing here? We've got, again, one key and one value. So our data here is two quantitative attributes. And what's the mark type? Well, actually, what we're really doing is we're just plotting a point, and then we are connecting those points with connection mark lines. So it's sort of an interestingly complicated thing compared to a bar chart, which is actually straightforward from this point of view. And in fact, in many line charts, you actually just don't even draw those points and you only draw these connecting lines. And sometimes you even smooth them. So noticing what's happening there is even less clear. So we're still having this idea that we're expressing a quantitative value with these aligned lengths, that we are still separating and ordering by that key attribute into these horizontal regions. Okay, so what's the task here? So structurally, this was similar. We just had one key and one value, but here we're really emphasizing trends. These connection marks between the dots are very strongly emphasizing the connection between, in this case, the years. So linking that up visually really leads you to see trends with line charts. In terms of scale, we can do roughly hundreds of these key levels, in this case of the years, and hundreds of these value levels. In this case, again, it's the weight of my particular cat across the year. You can see there was an enforced diet right in the middle there. Now, when would you choose a line chart versus a bar chart? That has to do with the characteristics of your data. So if your key attribute is categorical, bar charts are a good choice. If it is ordered, whether it's ordinal or quantitative, then line charts are appropriate. In particular, don't use line charts if your attributes are categorical. That expressiveness principle we talked about matching up, this is another example of it. There's a great study by Zaks and Tversky about what people did with these incredibly simple line and bar charts where they talk about age and they talk about gender. And the implication of trend is so strong, it can just override known semantics. So it makes sense to say the older you are, the taller you are. it doesn't make sense to say the more male you are, the taller you are. The more male a person is, the taller he is. People would literally say that because their thoughts were driven by the visual encoding to be thinking about trends, even when that's nonsensical. So we can get some guidance about which visual encodings to use according to what our data set characteristics are, in addition, of course, to what our tasks are. Some more practical hints about charts. It is useful to always think about labels. So far, we've been talking just about what is the spatial layout of things. But a lot of what makes a visualization useful is not only the visual encoding in terms of the use of space, which is what we're focusing on here, and other channels. It's that you turn that into something informative by adding labels. We'll talk later about small multiple views, having more than one view, or maybe you share axis labels. But in general, a good rule of thumb is that it is best practice to label axes, as we see from the glorious XKCD, which has a visualization-based cartoon for almost every principle you would ever want to illustrate, including this one. Some other best practices with chart axes is you do want to be extremely careful if you're ever cropping the y-axis that you've done that in a principled way. So typically you would want to include the 0 point on the bottom left. Otherwise, that differential between the height of these two things, the thing that we're so good at perceiving, otherwise it would mislead. In a well-named paper, Truncating the Y-Axis, Threat or Menace by Michael Kroll, Enrico Bettini, and Steve Francaneri, they had a nice analysis of what were some of the cases of where you are being deceptive versus honest, and it depends on whether or not what would count as misleading. For example, in this case of the global temperature, if you actually need to see these small changes because they matter, then you would not have a y-axis that goes all the way down to 0 because you'd be unable to see that change. So there are a lot of great examples in that paper that sort of analyze this question of, what is your goal, and thus what is the meaning of misleading, given your goal and the characteristics of your data. So, we can build off this idea of a line chart and have things where we think about deriving data. So an indexed line chart is where, again, we've got two quantitative attributes, a key and a value, and what we derive is a new quantitative value attribute where, indexing means that you're saying change relative to some baseline where the baseline is some other value. For example, in this, time series data, you can index according to some other year's worth of data. So this is very good for the task of showing change over time. And the principle here, and this is a principle that's going to come up a lot, is that what we want to do is normalize rather than show absolute data in many cases. So this is an example where the normalization process is happening through that derivation where we show it with respect to an index value. And we're going to come across this principle many, many other times of thinking about when should you show relative things rather than absolute things, not just from a perceptual point of view, but from a data set semantics point of view. So the scalability of this is the same as a standard line chart. No different scale analysis here. Another idiom, with Gantt charts, we've got a situation where we've got one key and two related values. And so we've got a categorical attribute and then two quantitative attributes. So think of this as sort of a variation on a bar chart where we're using the length to mean one thing, in this case, the duration of a particular task. And then we're using horizontal position in two ways. We've got the start time that we're encoding, and we are also encoding the end time. So we can separately read off duration versus start versus end. And the point of these charts is we are really trying to emphasize temporal overlaps and start-end dependencies between these items. So you're really trying to often look at dependencies because you can read off things like when is one end time before one start time. In terms of scalability, we'll have dozens of key levels. These are these bars. And we could have up to hundreds of value levels. That is how much, how many different possible lengths could you perceive? Those are these durations, definitely hundreds, again, in our 1,000 by 1,000 pixel conjectured window size. Here's another idiom, slope graphs. So this is an interesting one. We've got two values, and they're both quantitative value attributes. So in this case, back to this soccer data, we've got rankings of teams at two different times. And then what we do is we have a derived attribute, which is the magnitude of the change. So, and the magnitude of the change is something that we're able to see because what we do is we have these point marks for these absolute numbers, and then we have a connecting mark. So these lines connecting these two axis values are emphasizing these relationships. So we've got vertical position along one axis, we've got vertical position along another axis, and then of course the slope of the line is what we are explicitly seeing that falls out of these ranking changes. And you can do also things like line width and color as well. Notice how these are redundantly coded in this particular thing of they are all the downsloping lines are red, all the upsloping lines are blue. That's an example of a redundant use of visual channels. So for scalability, well, we could have hundreds of different value levels, right? Because we've got that fine-grained ability to see different 2D spatial positions. And we could fit maybe dozens of items, right, of these shared, point line mark in between before we might get too much clutter to be visible. What about two keys? So what about the case where we really want to use a matrix style arrangement for two keys as opposed to a basic list arrangement, even if we add keys in other ways? Now let's have two keys be the first class citizens of the layout backbone. So the heat map is a classic example of a matrix style view where we've got two keys and then which are categorical attributes and one quantitative attribute. So in this case, we can have a classic biological example. These are heavily used in biology, where one of the categorical attributes is a gene, the other is an experimental condition. And then the measured amount of proteins that the gene makes, what's called an expression level, is the quantitative attribute. So structurally, what is happening here is we have a bunch of marks, and these are being separated and aligned not in one dimension in a linear list, but in two dimensions into a matrix style layout. So you are then able to index into this matrix according to each one of these keys. Now, I also want you to notice that you're coloring by some quantitative attribute, and it's in fact diverging. This has a 0 point, and it goes up from that and down from that in terms of the amount of proteins that are made. The tasks that are typically done with heat maps are to find clusters and to find outliers. So outliers can really jump out at you, and as we'll see in a moment when we talk about ordering, it's also able to show cluster structure. I want to focus on the scalability here because it's a lot. In the limit, if you had a 1 pixel wide mark, a point mark for these, you could actually fit 1 million items. You could have 1,000 by 1,000. And the point of heat maps is that they are a very compact representation of a lot of data. So you could have, hundreds of levels on each side, up to about 1,000 on one and 1,000 on the other. That's where we got the 1 million items from. But, and here's another asymmetry. Can you see 1 million, can you see hundreds of different levels of that quantitative attribute? Absolutely not. We can see there's black and there's sort of, dark green, sort of middle green, maybe, brighter green, maybe brightest green. We're basically seeing about 4 or 5 levels of green and about 4 or 5 levels of red. So, we can get maybe 10 levels of that quantitative attribute. We are not going to be able to have hundreds of levels of that. So although we have this really high resolution ability to read off spatial position, we have a much lower ability to read off the saturation of these colors, as we'll talk about more later when we get to colors. What I do want to point out is that what's extremely common is to have reordering algorithms in use when we have heat maps, because the ability to see cluster structure requires typically some sort of computation so that if these are truly categorical attributes, where you're picking an arbitrary order to order them along these horizontal and vertical axes, then we get great benefit by actually doing some sort of algorithmic reordering. This is known by a number of different names. It's something called seriation or matrix reordering. So there are many different names for these algorithms. The key thing is that using them then means that this visualization becomes useful for seeing cluster structure in particular. So seeing those clusters and the outliers. Finally, what's very common is that if you do this kind of reordering, people often pair this matrix view of the heat map with an explicit depiction of how this ordering occurred. So what's called a cluster heat map is where, in addition to that base data, you actually generate these hierarchical clusterings of the data, which also shows how the reordering occurred. And then explicitly show this with a depiction of the tree. We'll talk more about trees in the network section, but I'll just say for now it's a dendrogram where you're able to see these parent-child relationships explicitly, and there's an alignment so that it's easy to compare the heights of those interior branches to understand the order of this clustering. So then the marks can be reordered by traversing this cluster hierarchy to preserve those cluster relationships. And then typically, so why are we looking at this with our eyes? It's to assess the quality of these clusters. So there's some automatic method to find it, and then the human's looking at it and trying to interpret whether or not this is believable, often according to some sort of explicit domain knowledge they might have.